She looked me in the eye and lied. "I'm not sure when the wedding is, Harold. You know how the young ones are. Everything's on social media now." Her voice had that syrupy politeness that hides contempt, the kind that slides under your skin and burns later. My daughter-in-law, Melissa, stood in my kitchen that morning pretending to look for her car keys, but I saw the edge of an ivory envelope sticking out of her purse, the same ivory I'd chosen 40 years ago for my own wedding invitations. "I'm Harold Thompson, 62, retired English teacher, widower for 5 years. My son, David, is 35. He used to come over every Sunday for pancakes and coffee after his mother passed. Then Melissa came into his life and those Sundays quietly vanished, one excuse after another, until they were gone entirely. I knew she never liked me, but I didn't think she'd go so far as to erase me. A week later, I found out from a neighbor that David's wedding had already happened, at St. Paul's Church, right in town, 3 blocks from my house. I stood there in the yard listening to her say it, the sound of a lawnmower in the distance, the smell of fresh grass mixing with disbelief. My own son had married without me. The humiliation hit like cold water. People in town know me. I taught half their children. They'd seen the photos on Facebook before I had even heard the vows were spoken. That night, I sat at my kitchen table under the yellow light of the old lamp Margaret bought before she died. The invitation Melissa had hidden, the one I never saw, haunted me like a missing word in a sentence that refuses to make sense. But grief has a strange way of clarifying things. Once the ache settled, it left behind something sharper. That's when I decided to give them a wedding gift they would never forget. It started with a box, an old walnut jewelry box that once belonged to Margaret. Inside it, I placed a letter, not bitter, not angry, just deliberate. I told them I wished them joy, that I hoped they'd build a marriage stronger than deceit. Beneath the letter, I tucked a check for $50,000, Margaret's life insurance money I'd never touched. And at the bottom, I slipped a note that read, "I would have handed this to you in person had I known when to show up." Then I sent it by courier. No card, no return address, just the gift, perfectly timed for their honeymoon flight. The irony, the entire town learned about my gift before David did. Melissa had boasted to a friend that I wasn't invited, and that same friend couldn't resist spreading the story once the money arrived. Small towns have long memories and even longer tongues. By the time David called, panic colored his voice. "Dad, what's this check? Why would you send?" "I just wanted to congratulate you," I said. "I didn't know the date." Silence. Then, almost a whisper, "Dad, I thought we mailed you the invitation." I didn't say anything. Silence can speak like thunder when it wants to. He hung up. 2 hours later, Melissa called. Her tone was sugary again, but there was an edge to it, sharp enough to cut glass. "Mr. Thompson, that gift was far too generous. We can't possibly accept." "You already did," I replied. That's when she started to crack. I could hear it in her breath, the tremor under her words, because she knew I knew. But what she didn't know was that the check wasn't the real gift. It was just the beginning. Looking back now, that was the exact second when revenge started breathing inside me. After that day, David began visiting again, cautiously, as if testing the temperature of old water. We had coffee on the porch. He brought up the past, half apologies hanging in the air like smoke. I let him talk. Sometimes forgiveness isn't words, it's patience. Melissa, on the other hand, couldn't hide her discomfort. The next time I saw her was at a Sunday brunch she had graciously invited me to. The way she said my name at the door, Harold, was so brittle I thought it might shatter. She wore a soft pink dress, a picture of politeness for the neighbors, but her eyes never met mine for more than a second. When I handed her the small bouquet of lilies, she flinched slightly, as if flowers carried guilt. At the table, she laughed too loudly, complimented everything I said, but every smile she forced reminded her that I wasn't supposed to be there. David tried to make conversation, but tension hung thick as syrup. And then, halfway through dessert, a guest asked about the wedding photographer. "You must have some beautiful pictures," the woman said. Melissa froze. She looked at me, then at David, then down at her plate. I smiled gently. I'd love to see them too. That's when David realized what had really happened. The lie, the missing invitation, all of it. The silence around that table was so absolute that even the clock on the wall seemed afraid to tick. He stood up abruptly, excused himself, and I heard the back door close. Melissa followed. The rest of us stayed seated, pretending not to listen to the storm brewing outside. But I did. I listened to every word. "Why would you hide it, Melissa?" David's voice trembled. "You made me look like a fool. I just wanted peace, David. He's always judging me. He's my father." The argument spilled into the street, their voices echoing off the houses. I didn't move. I just watched from the window the same way I used to watch the schoolyard fights, not with joy, but with inevitability. When Melissa finally came back inside, her mascara streaked, she walked straight to me and whispered, "I hope you're happy." I looked at her, calm as still water. "No, but I'm satisfied." 2 weeks later, she showed up at my door, alone, no makeup, no pretense. She said she wanted to apologize. I let her in, poured her coffee. She talked for an hour about insecurity, fear, wanting to protect their relationship from what she thought was my judgment. I listened. She was right about one thing. I had judged her, quietly, the way teachers do, but I never hated her. When she finished, I told her something she didn't expect. "Melissa, you can't erase family, not with an invitation, not with silence." She cried then, real tears this time, and maybe that was the beginning of her redemption, or maybe it was just relief. Either way, something shifted, because sometimes revenge isn't destruction, sometimes it's clarity, watching someone face the mirror they've avoided for too long. And yet, the story wasn't over, not even close. Months later, a letter arrived in my mailbox, no return address again. Inside was a photograph, Melissa, pregnant, standing by the church steps. Beneath it, a note in David's handwriting, "We'd like you to be there this time." But what happened next changed everything, and it wasn't joy that followed. Should I continue with the next part of the story, where the pregnancy leads to a deeper betrayal and Harold's final act of poetic justice takes shape? When I saw that photograph, I stared at it for a long time, not because of the message, but because of what it represented. A new beginning, a bridge, maybe, or a trap. I placed it on the mantel next to Margaret's picture, and for the first time in years, I spoke to her out loud. "Did you see this, honey? He's going to be a father." The house was silent except for the clock ticking, the kind of silence that holds its breath waiting for what comes next. I wanted to believe that everything had shifted, that Melissa's apology meant something real, so I went to that baby shower they invited me to, held at a little cafe near the old market downtown. It smelled of coffee and cinnamon rolls, with chatter all around. I even bought a small silver rattle, engraved with the initials T, Tirsa, because they'd chosen the name Thomas for the baby. For a while, things seemed almost normal. We talked, we laughed, we remembered Margaret. But peace built on guilt never lasts long. It started with a phone call one morning in February. The voice on the other end was from the local bank. "Mr. Thompson," the woman said cautiously, "we just wanted to confirm your withdrawal request." "What withdrawal request?" I asked. She hesitated, then said, "The $20,000 transfer from your savings to an account under the name Melissa Thompson." I nearly dropped the phone. She had somehow gotten access to my old documents. I spent the rest of that day at the bank, sorting through signatures and security checks. Melissa had forged my name. The proof was right there, her handwriting a little loopier than mine. When I confronted her, she didn't even deny it. "You have so much qui, Harold," she said, crying without tears. "It was just for the baby's room. David didn't need to know." That moment, something inside me went still. I didn't shout. I didn't even stand up. I just looked at her and said, "You're right, Melissa. David doesn't need to know, not yet." Because by then, I had a plan. It took me weeks to set it up. I went to my lawyer, an old friend named Walter, and asked about trust funds, inheritance structures, legal surprises. We built something airtight, a future for David and the baby that excluded Melissa entirely, unless she proved her loyalty. The first step was a letter, one she wouldn't see until it was too late. The second step was patience, and I've had a lifetime of that. But the strangest part, as I watched her crumble under her own lies, I started feeling something close to pity. She wasn't evil, she was just desperate, the way people get when they believe they're owed more than life gave them. Still, pity doesn't erase consequences. The baby was born in late May, healthy and loud. David called me from the hospital, his voice trembling with pride. "Dad, you have to meet him." When I held Thomas for the first time, his tiny fingers wrapped around mine like forgiveness itself. Melissa smiled, tired but radiant, and for a brief, deceptive moment, I thought maybe this child could mend us. But then, about 2 months later, the cracks widened again. A friend from church mentioned seeing Melissa having lunch with a man at a hotel restaurant out of town. "Could have been business," she said, "but they didn't look like coworkers." I didn't want to believe it. But then came the late-night calls David ignored, the secretive text messages, the trips that didn't match her stories. I stayed quiet, watching, waiting. And then one evening, David came to my house with tears in his eyes. "Dad, she left," he said. "She said she needed space." He looked like a boy again, lost and broken. I poured him a drink and let him talk until the words ran out. Then I said, "Son, space can be a blessing in disguise. Sometimes people leave because truth is catching up." A month later, Melissa came back, not to David, but to me. She looked exhausted, her clothes unpressed, her eyes hollow. "Harold, please," she said, "don't tell him about the money." She had no idea I'd already told my lawyer everything, that the forged transfer was documented and safe in legal hands. I let her plead. When she stopped talking, I said quietly, "You think revenge is something loud, Melissa, but it's not. It's a mirror. You've been looking into yours for months." She didn't understand then, but she would soon, because my final gift wasn't a letter or a check. It was a public one. A few weeks later, David organized a small gathering at the community center to celebrate Thomas's christening. Melissa showed up dressed perfectly again, her facade polished and restored. Everyone was there, neighbors, friends, even my old students. Midway through the event, David asked if I'd like to say a few words. I stood, walked to the microphone, and smiled gently. "Family," I began, "isn't something we choose, it's something we prove." People nodded, smiling. I continued, "This little boy represents a chance for truth to outlive lies." Then I handed David a sealed envelope. "This is something I prepared for his future. It's a trust fund, one that activates when he turns 18. Applause. Melissa smiled, relieved. Then I added, "And the terms are simple. The trust remains in place as long as his parents remain honest to each other." The room went silent. Melissa's face drained of color. She understood. Every lie she told, every document she forged, every secret she tried to bury, it was now bound to the very future she wanted to control. David looked at her, confused at first, then slowly realizing. "Melissa," he whispered. She tried to speak, but no words came. I left the stage quietly, sat down, and sipped my coffee. That night, after everyone had gone, David showed up at my door again. "Dad," he said, voice trembling, "thank you." I looked at him and said, "Don't thank me yet. Just be the father that boy deserves." Weeks passed, and the storm finally broke. Melissa moved out for good. The town, as small towns do, whispered its way through every detail. Some pitied her, some blamed me. I didn't care. What mattered was that my son had learned to see clearly, and my grandson would grow up without learning deceit as a family language. I still keep that photograph of Melissa pregnant on the mantle, not out of anger, but as a reminder. People will always try to hide invitations, to keep others out of their celebrations, their lives, their truths. But sometimes the best revenge is simply showing up anyway, in your own time, with a gift that teaches more than it takes. Now, when I walk to church on Sundays, neighbors stop to talk, to ask how David and the baby are doing. I tell them the truth. They're fine. We're all learning. And sometimes, on quiet evenings, when I hear Thomas's laughter through the phone, I think maybe Margaret was right all along. Revenge isn't justice. It's just another word for setting the record straight. It's strange how quickly years begin to blur when you reach your 60s. The seasons blend, the faces of neighbors shift, and one day you look at the mirror and realize your hands have become your father's. After that christening, life settled into a quiet rhythm again. David and little Thomas moved into a smaller house a few streets away. I helped with the baby as much as I could, walking him in his stroller through the park, humming the same tune Margaret used to sing while watering her plants. Sometimes I'd catch myself smiling without realizing it, the kind of smile that comes from a peace you didn't think you'd ever earn again. Melissa stayed gone for a while. I heard bits and pieces. She'd moved 2 towns over, started working part-time at a boutique, trying to rebuild whatever pieces of herself hadn't crumbled under guilt and exposure. I didn't hate her. Truth be told, I missed her sometimes, or at least the version of her that once tried to love my son. People are rarely just villains. They're mosaics of hurt and hunger. Thomas grew fast. By the time he turned 5, he had his father's gentle eyes and his grandmother's smile. Every Friday afternoon, David would drop him off at my place and we'd bake cookies together, though most of the dough never reached the oven. We'd sit on the porch afterward, his tiny legs swinging over the edge while he told me stories about kindergarten. I started calling those evenings our Friday peace. They became sacred. David was dating again by then. Careful, kind women who treated Thomas gently but didn't stay long. He was cautious, maybe too cautious, carrying the ghost of Melissa's betrayal like a scar across his heart. I told him once, "Scars don't have to hurt forever, son. They can just remind you where the lesson lives." He nodded, but I could see he wasn't ready yet. Years passed. One winter morning, a letter arrived, handwritten, familiar handwriting. I recognized the loops in the M before I even opened it. Melissa. She wrote that she'd been sober for 2 years, that she'd been attending therapy, and that she missed her son. I know I have no right to ask, she wrote, but I'd like to see Thomas, just once. Please ask David for me. I won't go around him directly. I sat at the table for hours, reading the letter again and again. The old anger tried to rise, but it didn't stick. There's a strange mercy that comes with age. You start wanting closure more than revenge. Still, I knew David's heart. If I brought this to him, he'd close up again like a clam. So I didn't, not right away. Instead, I drove to the edge of town, to that little boutique she'd mentioned, pretending to be an ordinary customer. She didn't see me at first. She was helping an older woman choose a scarf, her voice calm, her movements careful, almost fragile. When she turned and saw me, her face froze. For a second, I thought she might cry, but she didn't. She just said quietly, "Harold." We talked for nearly an hour outside in the cold. She told me about her sobriety, her small apartment, the nights she spent reading poetry to keep herself from drinking again. There was something raw and human about her, stripped of vanity and lies. Before I left, she asked me one more time. Just one visit. I won't say a word out of place. I didn't promise anything. I only said, "We'll see." That night, I sat by the fire, Thomas asleep on the couch beside me, his small chest rising and falling under a blanket. I looked at him and thought of forgiveness, the kind that costs something. I thought of Margaret, too, and what she would have done. She always believed in second chances, even when people didn't deserve them. Maybe that's why people loved her so much. The next morning, I called David. "Son," I said, "there's something you should know." I told him about the letter, about seeing Melissa. Silence filled the line. Then came a sigh, long and heavy. "Dad, I don't want her confusing Thomas. He's happy." "I know," I said, "but children deserve to know their story, even the painful parts." There was another pause. Then, "Let me think about it." Weeks went by. I didn't push him. Then, one Sunday afternoon, as Thomas and I were painting on the porch, David came by. He looked tired but calm. "Dad," he said quietly. "I called her." I looked up. "And we're going to let her see him. Supervised. Just once. I'll be there." I nodded. Sometimes love isn't about protecting people from pain. It's about helping them survive it. The meeting took place at the church garden behind St. Paul's, the same one where David had married her years ago. I went with them, though I stayed at a distance, sitting on a bench near the roses. Melissa arrived early. When she saw Thomas, her whole body trembled. She knelt down and whispered, "You've grown so much." He looked up at David, uncertain, then at me. I nodded, and he stepped closer. "You're my mommy?" he asked. Her face crumpled. "Yes, baby, I am." They sat together for an hour, just talking about toys and cartoons and school, nothing heavy. When it was time to go, Thomas hugged her. She cried into his hair, and I saw something inside David break and heal at the same time. Later that night, he came to my house and said, "I think that's what she needed, maybe what I needed too." After that, things changed, not dramatically, but quietly. Melissa started coming by occasionally, just for short visits, always respectful, always sober. The town still whispered, of course. Small towns never stop, but people saw her effort, and some softened. I did too. One afternoon she came to return a book I'd lent her years ago, Margaret's favorite poetry collection. "She marked this one," she said, pointing to a page. The verse read, "To forgive is not to forget, but to remember without hatred." I closed the book and said, "She'd like that you found it." For a while, life found its balance again. Thomas was 10 now, full of questions about the world. He loved drawing, and sometimes I'd catch him sketching family portraits. Me, David, him, and, surprisingly, Melissa too. When I asked him why, he said, "Because everyone belongs, Grandpa, even when they do bad stuff. Kids understand truth better than we do sometimes." That fall, I started feeling tired more often. My hands shook when I wrote. The doctor said it was nothing serious at first, just blood pressure, stress, but after more tests, it turned out to be something else. Early-stage Parkinson's. I remember sitting in the parking lot afterward, watching people come and go, thinking about all the small things I'd soon struggle with. Tying a tie, holding a pen, lifting my grandson. I didn't tell David right away. I needed time to make peace with it. So I did what I always do. I wrote letters. One for David, one for Thomas, one even for Melissa. They weren't goodbye letters, more like guides for when I couldn't explain things anymore. When I finally told them, David cried quietly, the way men cry when they're too proud to let it show. Melissa came by with food and sat with me for hours, helping me write thank you notes for the church. Her hands were steady, her voice soft. Somewhere along the way, I realized that forgiveness had already happened, not as an event, but as a slow, persistent surrender. Months later, on my birthday, they surprised me. David brought Thomas and Melissa. She'd baked a cake. Chocolate, Margaret's favorite. Thomas ran up to me with a small box. "Open it, Grandpa." Inside was a watch. Gold, old-fashioned. On the back, engraved, "Time heals in silence." I couldn't speak for a while. Melissa looked at me and said quietly, "I wanted to make up for the time I tried to take away." That night, after everyone left, I sat by the window listening to crickets. The world outside seemed softer somehow, as if time itself had loosened its grip. I thought about everything, the hidden invitation, the lies, the years of distance, and I realized revenge hadn't given me peace. Truth had. Revenge only started the process. Truth finished it. Now, years later, I'm 70. My hands shake when I pour my coffee, but my mind is still sharp enough to hold every detail. Thomas is in high school now. Tall, kind, smarter than he realizes. Melissa visits on weekends sometimes, helps me with the garden. David remarried last year, to a woman who laughs with her whole face. Life, against all odds, found a way to grow again from the ashes. Sometimes, people ask if I regret what I did, the check, the speech, the public exposure. I don't. Regret is for the unexamined. Everything that happened shaped the family I have now. Even Melissa, for all her mistakes, became part of the lesson. When Thomas asked me recently, "Grandpa, what does revenge mean?" I told him, "It means turning pain into purpose, but it's only worth it if you stop before it turns you cruel." He nodded, thoughtful, as if storing it away for later. The other day, I found that old invitation she hid all those years ago. It was inside a book in the attic, untouched, yellowed around the edges. I held it for a moment, then placed it in a frame next to the watch she gave me. Both reminders of time, one stolen, one returned. And sometimes, when the sun sets low through my window and paints the room gold, I hear Margaret's voice in my head, gentle as ever. "You did all right, Harold." Maybe I did. Maybe forgiveness isn't about being kind to others. It's about freeing yourself from the weight of waiting for an apology that may never come. The first time my hand failed me in public, I was standing in line at the hardware store on Jefferson Avenue, trying to pay for a small brass hinge for the porch door. My fingers wouldn't grip the card and it skittered to the floor. A teenage clerk with a nose ring bent to pick it up, kind as sunrise. "You're good, sir," she said, and ran the card for me. On the walk home, I kept the hinge in my coat pocket like a secret I wasn't ready to say out loud. Back at the house, I brewed coffee, dark, strong, the way Margaret used to insist it could fix anything, and stared at the steam as if it carried answers. It didn't. Answers came from people, and lately my people were showing up in ways that surprised me. Melissa had been weeding the garden on Saturdays, careful and quiet, leaving mason jars of hydrangeas on the kitchen table with a sticky note that read, "For brightness." David had learned to laugh again, an open-throated sound that filled rooms, and Thomas, taller every week, had begun to borrow my phrases and toss them back at me whenever I complained about time. "Grandpa, time's a river. You taught me that." That evening, they came over with takeout from the little soul food place on Maple. We ate catfish and collard greens at the kitchen counter, and when my hand shook too much to spear a piece of cornbread, Melissa reached out without a word and steadied my wrist. It was nothing, and it was everything. After dinner, while David washed dishes and Thomas did his homework at the table, Melissa handed me a folded bank statement. "I've been saving," she said, eyes steady, "every month since I got sober. With interest, it's a little over $27,000. I know it doesn't undo what I did, but it's a start." I opened the paper and saw the running ledger, the sacrifices between the lines. No splurges, no trips, just the long, patient climb of someone building a life one small choice at a time. "Melissa," I said, and had to stop because my voice had too much gravel in it. "You didn't have to." She shook her head. "I did." We heard Thomas in the living room mutter, "I can hear you," without looking up from his math. A smile tugged at my mouth. Family is an echo chamber where truth keeps repeating until it's learned. 2 days later, in a moment of strange courage, I recorded a message on my old phone for the archive Thomas insisted I keep. Little audio journals he said he wanted when I was old, which made me laugh. "If you're listening to this," I said into the mic, "tell me where you're hearing it from. The porch, the kitchen, maybe the car on the way to school. Or if you're someone else stumbling into our story online, drop the city and state where you are. I want to know how far a family's voice can travel." My grandson later posted these audio clips to the channel he runs for me. He calls it Stories with Harold, and somehow people really did answer. Windsor, Ontario, Savannah, Georgia, Oxnard, California, Toowoomba, Australia. Their words poured in like postcards. and for the first time it felt like the town's gaze on us had widened into something gentler, a crowd of strangers nodding along. One wet Tuesday morning, the phone rattled across the table. It was the pastor from St. Paul's. "Harold, could you drop by? Church board business." I sighed and pulled on a jacket. The rain made the town look like a watercolor left out too long. In the pastor's office, I found not just him but 2 board members and a man in a suit I didn't recognize. The man smiled like a blade. "Mr. Thompson, I'm representing a developer interested in purchasing the old parsonage lot. We understand you hold some influence with the congregation." The pastor looked apologetic. "They want a mixed-use building, shops below, apartments above. It would wipe the garden." I felt my jaw set. The garden where Thomas first met his mother, where forgiveness had been carefully grafted like a rose. "No," I said, more calmly than I felt. "That ground is not for sale." The lawyer slid a paper across the desk, numbers marching down the page like soldiers. There would be generous donations to certain funds. He meant personal envelopes. He meant two-faced charity. I pushed the paper back. "The garden stays." He left with his slick smile and wet shoes, and the pastor exhaled as if he'd been holding his breath through the entire meeting. On the walk home, I realized I'd made a promise I might not be strong enough to keep alone. That night, I told Melissa and David everything. Melissa set her jaw. "They won't bulldoze where my son first hugged me." The next morning, she showed up at my door with a clipboard, a thermos of coffee, and an army of church ladies in cardigans who could out-organize a mayor. They called themselves the Garden Keepers and arranged a petition, a bake sale, and, because this is America, a music night in the church hall with a raffle prize of 2 tickets to a Red Sox game a cousin donated. The developer's second letter arrived 3 weeks later. More money, more pressure. This time he added a nasty footnote. If the church refused, he'd lobby city council to revoke the small grant they received for the soup kitchen on grounds of inefficient use of public land. When I read that, heat climbed my spine. People who weaponize hunger deserve to meet their own reflection up close. I made some calls to former students who'd become journalists, to an alderwoman who remembered her Shakespeare lines in my 9th grade class, to a friend who runs the farmer's market. We organized a Sunday event in the garden, with music, pie, prayer, and the local paper snapping photos. Kids chalked messages on the walkway. "Please keep our flowers." This place gave back my mom. That last one froze me where I stood. When I looked up, Melissa was watching Thomas put the chalk down. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Midway through the afternoon, the developer himself arrived, stone-faced, hands in pockets. He walked the perimeter like he was measuring. I met him by the bench. "You see all this?" I said. He shrugged. "Sentiment. It won't stand against paperwork." "You're right," I said. "Sentiment doesn't. Stories do." He snorted. "What's the difference?" "Stories have witnesses." I gestured at the crowd. "And consequences." That evening, long after the tables were folded and the hymn sheets stacked, the alderwoman called. The council had read the room. The grant would be safe. The parsonage lot would be zoned for community use only. The developer could build his shop somewhere that didn't depend on a bulldozed memory to make a profit. When I hung up, my hands trembled the way they do now. I thought it was the Parkinson's, but later I realized it was joy. Weeks blurred again. Summer rounded its shoulders into fall. One afternoon, I was teaching Thomas how to tie a proper Windsor knot for a debate he'd entered, when my vision blurred and my legs forgot the choreography of standing. I sat down quickly. Thomas's eyes sharpened with that old soul seriousness he carries. "Grandpa?" "Lightheaded," I lied. My body was writing a story I couldn't edit. That evening, Melissa insisted on driving me to the neurologist in her dented Corolla, the one that smells faintly of lemon cleaner and fabric softener sheets. She listened as the doctor explained adjustments in my meds, changes to expect. In the parking lot, rain freckled the windshield and she said, "I'm not going anywhere. Don't make promises you can't keep," I said gently. She gripped the wheel. I'm not going anywhere." That first day in the garden when Thomas hugged me, I decided to earn that for the rest of my life. I nodded, swallowing a lump. On the ride home, we passed the diner where I used to take David for pancakes, the bell on the door still ringing the same waitress scribbling orders like a composer. The world remains itself even when you're changing inside it. A week later came a new kind of trouble. A letter with the neat typeface of legal forms and the messy heart of greed. It was from Melissa's half-brother, a man I'd met twice and disliked both times for reasons I couldn't have fully articulated then. Something about the fast eyes, the slower conscience. He had hired a lawyer to challenge the trust I'd established for Thomas, arguing that because Melissa had once been married to David, certain provisions unfairly restricted maternal discretion. He wanted a hearing. a chance to pry open what I'd locked down. David's mouth flattened into a line when he read it. He doesn't care about Thomas, he said. He wants leverage. Then we won't give him any, I answered. But nights got thinner after that. I lay awake listening to the house creak, to the soft buzz of the refrigerator, to the echo of my own breathing as if it belonged to someone else. The hearing date landed like a stone in the middle of our calendar. On the morning of I ironed a shirt with more care than I'd used in months and slipped on the gold watch Melissa gave me. The engraving caught the light. Time heals in silence. We sat on a hard bench in the courtroom while the half-brother's lawyer performed his particular theater, lamenting Melissa's exile from decision-making, implying that the trust was a tool of humiliation, a relic of an angry patriarch. That word tried to stick to me like a burr. When it was our turn, Walter, my old friend and lawyer, stood slowly and didn't perform anything. He simply unfolded fact after fact, the forged transfer we'd already rectified, the years of sobriety, the structured returns Melissa had made, the community service she'd logged at the soup kitchen. Then he did something I hadn't expected. He called Melissa to the stand. She glanced back at us. I nodded. She told the judge the plain, unvarnished truth. I hurt this family, she said. I stole and I lied. The trust didn't punish me. It protected the one person who couldn't protect himself yet. It gave me a finish line to run toward. I don't want it changed. I want it honored. For a second, the room lost its edges. The judge regarded her, then looked down at the documents again, then back at us. The ruling came an hour later. The challenge was denied. The trust would stand unchanged. The half-brother left red-eared and muttering about appeals he would not, in the end, file. In the hallway outside, Melissa leaned against the cool tile and exhaled. That's one, she said, almost to herself. One what? I asked. One thing I didn't ruin. We celebrated with pie at the diner. Thomas claimed 2/3 of a pecan slice and the waitress pretended not to notice. Melissa excused herself to make a call and came back with damp eyes she pretended were from laughter. I just needed to hear my sponsor's voice, she said. Redemption is not a staircase. It's a spiral you have to keep walking on purpose. Winter returned with its particular hush. My hands learned new tremors. My legs learned caution. One night during a windstorm, the porch door came loose, the old hinge I'd bought months before, unused. So I shuffled into the rain, stubborn as ever, to fix it. The porch light flickered, the thunder rolled its shoulders, and the screwdriver slipped from my hand, clattering into the dark. I swore, not softly. Then another hand took the screwdriver from the floor and pressed it into my palm, warm and steady. Melissa stood there, soaked, hair plastered to her cheeks. Saw your light from the road, she said. We worked in silence, the rain drumming on the roof like a metronome for a song older than either of us. The hinge finally took. I turned to thank her and found her looking not at me, but at the framed invitation and watched through the window. Side by side. You kept them together, she said. Time stolen, time returned, I answered. She reached out and squeezed my forearm. I owe you more time, she whispered. The next week she started showing up at sunrise, brewing coffee before I was fully awake, labeling pillboxes with a schoolteacher's neatness, driving me to the barber on South Street where the radio still plays Motown, and the barber still calls me professor. When a bad day hit hard and my legs simply refused, she sat on the rug with me until my breath slowed to something usable. I was so sure I'd spend my life taking, she said once, eyes on the blank TV screen reflecting us. Turns out giving is less expensive than regret. Mid-March, Thomas won that debate. The topic was legacy, and he opened with a line that made my chest rattle. A legacy is what remains when excuses are done talking. He looked at me when he said it, not in triumph but in tenderness. On the drive home he turned the radio down and said, Grandpa, I think I know what I want to do. Tell me, I said. I want to be a public defender. For people who made one bad decision and need someone to believe their next one can be better. I swallowed hard. Make sure you keep your soul in your briefcase, I said. He laughed, then grew serious. I will. At the end of that spring, the pastor announced a plan to add benches to the garden, with small brass plaques in honor of stories that had unfolded there. The congregation nominated names. On dedication day, the garden smelled of fresh cedar and damp soil. A choir of sparrows provided the music. We walked the path, reading the plaques. Then we reached the bench under the maple where Thomas first asked, Are you my mommy? The plaque read, For the day truth outlived shame. I traced the letters with a shaking thumb and felt something lift off my shoulders I hadn't known was perched there all this time. Later that evening, the sky clouded and a soft rain began to thread the air. Melissa and I sat on my porch, the new hinge holding steady, She pulled a small velvet box from her pocket and pressed it into my hand. "Don't panic," she said with a half smile. Inside was a ring, not for me, thin gold, a tiny emerald. "For Thomas," she said. "When he turns 18, his birthstone, I want him to have something that says I didn't miss everything." I closed the box and handed it back. "You give it to him," I said. "On that day, not before. That way the giving and the keeping happen at once." She nodded, and I saw tears balance in her eyes and decide to stay where they were. But I had a plan that no one, not even myself, could have predicted, and it started with a letter I wrote that night, careful as if each word was a small glass bird. In it, I changed the executor of the trust from Walter to two people, David and Melissa together, with a fail-safe clause that triggered only if they worked in concert. If one tried to move alone, nothing would budge. If they moved together, it would open like a well-made watch. I sealed the letter and placed it with the legal packet, then wrote a note for Thomas to be read if my voice ever left before my story did. Days later, before I could tell them, the universe rolled its dice again. I was standing in the market by the peaches when my legs folded like a card table, and the ceiling swam toward me. When I woke, a paramedic was saying my name, and Melissa was holding my hand so tight the pain snapped me fully back into the room. At the hospital, tests stabilized, alarms quieted. The doctor said it was a medication interaction, a solvable riddle. In the dull gray hours that followed, Melissa fell asleep in the chair beside me, head tilted at an angle that would punish her neck later. I watched her breathe and realized the final truth that had been building. I had engineered revenge years ago to make deceit face itself, but what was saving us now wasn't the clever machinery I designed. It was loyalty, chosen daily by a woman who once ran from every hard thing. Dawn leaked into the room. I cleared my throat. "Melissa?" She startled awake. "I'm here. I know," I said, "and I need you to read a letter when we get home." Her brows lifted. "What letter?" "The one that changes everything again." When we got back home from the hospital, the morning light poured through the kitchen window like liquid gold, calm and ordinary, the kind of light that refuses to believe anything bad ever happens in this world. Melissa helped me settle into my chair by the table, then busied herself making tea, the way Margaret used to. 2 bags, steeped long enough to darken the water like polished wood. The house smelled of lemon oil and dust. My body was tired, heavier than I remembered it being even the week before, but my mind felt bright, almost fierce. I asked her to fetch the brown envelope from the desk drawer by the window. She brought it, hesitant, as if she already sensed something inside it would alter everything again. "Open it," I said. She sat across from me, her hands trembling slightly. When she unfolded the letter, her breath caught. She read silently, her eyes darting from line to line, then finally looked up at me. You changed the trust?" I nodded. "To you and David, together?" She blinked. "But why would you do that? You don't have to prove anything to me anymore." "It's not proof," I said softly. "It's partnership. You two have spent too many years orbiting each other like guilty stars, afraid to share the same sky. Thomas deserves better than that. This way, the future can only open if you both hold the key." She leaned back, wiping her eyes with her sleeve. "He'll never forgive me," she whispered. "He already has," I said. "He just hasn't said it yet." That afternoon David arrived, worried but calm, bringing soup and a half smile. Melissa handed him the letter without a word. He read it standing by the counter, jaw tightening, the muscle near his temple pulsing as it used to when he was a boy trying not to cry. When he finished, he set it down slowly. "Dad," he said, "this isn't necessary." "It is," I replied, "because life isn't about erasing mistakes. It's about building something stronger around the cracks." He stared at Melissa, then at me, then said, "Okay, we'll make it work." For the first time in years, I believed him. In the weeks that followed, something miraculous happened, not in the loud, cinematic sense, but in the quiet, domestic rhythm that makes miracles easy to miss. David started stopping by Melissa's place after work to discuss finances for the trust, then staying for coffee, then for dinner. Thomas noticed I'd, of course. Kids always do. He came over one evening grinning. "Grandpa, I think Mom and Dad are friends again." I smiled. That's how most good stories restart. Two people remembering they used to be friends. My health wobbled like a slow pendulum. Some days were sharp and clear, others blurred at the edges. Melissa learned how to read my face like a weather forecast. "Storm coming?" she'd ask, half teasing, half serious, when she saw my hand tremble too much. She handled it all with quiet competence that humbled me. One night, after helping me to bed, she sat in the chair beside me long after the lamp was off. I could hear her breathing, steady, present, Harold, she whispered, thinking I'd already drifted off. You changed everything for me. You made me want to be someone I wasn't ashamed of. I wanted to tell her she'd already become that person, but my throat wouldn't cooperate. I fell asleep listening to the rain. Spring returned. The maples flared green again. The air smelled of damp soil and lilac. Thomas was 17 now, all arms and legs, a tangle of youthful energy and curiosity. He spent afternoons helping me digitize old family photos for the online channel. We'd sit side by side at the computer while he scanned pictures of Margaret, of my classroom, of David as a boy with his first baseball glove. You had more hair than I thought, he'd tease. One day he found a photo of the garden dedication, Melissa's face half turned toward the camera, sunlight on her cheek. She looks happy, he said. She earned that, I told him. But peace never comes without one last test. Late that summer, my condition worsened. The tremors grew constant, my balance unreliable. I knew time was closing in, the kind of knowledge you feel in your bones before the doctors confirm it. I called Walter to finalize the papers, made sure everything was airtight, then told David and Melissa to come over one Sunday evening. I wanted them together. When they arrived, I asked them to sit by the window, where the light was softest. You know, I began, I used to think revenge was the same thing as justice. I thought I could design morality like a lesson plan, but I was wrong. What I did back then, hiding truth inside a gift, exposing lies in public, it taught me something I didn't expect. Revenge doesn't end a story, it only changes its narrator. Justice is when the story keeps going without shame. Melissa was crying before I finished. David looked down at his hands. You don't owe us these speeches, Dad, he said. You already gave us everything. I smiled. Not yet. There's one more thing. I handed them another envelope. When I go, there'll be an insurance policy. Half goes to Thomas for college, and the other half, if you both agree, goes to rebuild the town's library wing. Margaret always wanted that. Melissa wiped her eyes. We'll do it, she said. The next few months were gentle, almost sacred. My days grew smaller but richer. I spent mornings in the garden, listening to the hum of bees. In the afternoons, Melissa and Thomas read to me, novels, poems, sometimes just the newspaper. I liked hearing their voices weave together, the strange symmetry of past and future. Sometimes I'd close my eyes and pretend Margaret was there too, her laugh blending with theirs. The line between memory and presence grew beautifully thin. Then one morning, near autumn, I woke to find the world blurring softly at the edges, like an old photograph losing its focus. The pain was light, like a whisper. I knew what it meant. I called for Melissa. She came quickly, sat by my side, held my hand. Call David and Thomas, I said. It's time. She didn't argue. Within an hour, they were there. The three faces I loved most gathered in the golden morning light. I told Thomas to keep learning, to defend the broken, to stay kind. I told David I was proud of the man he became, not because of his strength, but because of his mercy. And to Melissa I said, you gave me more peace than you'll ever admit. She shook her head, tears falling freely now. No, Harold, you gave me my soul back. I felt the warmth in the room swell like sunlight through stained glass, then fade into something quieter. My last thought was of Margaret's voice. You did all right, Harold. I didn't see what came after, but I know what happened. The funeral was small, simple, exactly as I'd planned. The whole town came, including the pastor, the students I'd taught, even that clerk from the hardware store. They filled the pews of St. Paul's, and when the choir sang, the sound spilled out into the street like a benediction. David read a few words, but it was Melissa who surprised everyone. She stood at the front, hands steady, and said, "This man taught me that forgiveness isn't something you earn. It's something you protect." Every day, there wasn't a dry eye in the place. Weeks later, the lawyer's packet arrived. Inside, along with the legal documents, was a smaller envelope addressed to Melissa and David together. They opened it at the garden, sitting on that same bench beneath the maple. The note inside was short. You built this family twice. Keep building it. And when you sit here years from now, tell Thomas that every scar we carry is just proof we kept living. Time passed. The library wing was built, and they named it after Margaret. Thomas went to law school, just like he'd promised, and in his graduation speech he quoted something I'd once said, "Revenge is just anger that learned grammar. Forgiveness is when the sentence finally ends." The crowd laughed, but Melissa cried quietly in the front row. Sometimes, when she visits the garden, she still talks to me. She says the wind moves differently there, like it remembers our story. Maybe it does. Maybe memory itself is just love refusing to leave. And so the man who was once excluded from his own family's celebration ended up being the reason that family stayed whole. The invitation Melissa hid had begun a storm, but the letter I left became the calm that followed. In the end, we all got what we deserved, not revenge, not even redemption, just understanding, and that, I've learned, is the truest kind of peace there is. The first time Melissa returned to Harold's house after the funeral, the air still smelled faintly of his cologne, cedar and coffee, and the ghost of old books. The sunlight angled through the blinds the same way it always had, laying gold stripes across the floorboards. She stood in the doorway for a long time, hands clasped in front of her, not sure if she was trespassing on memory or being welcomed by it. The house was quiet, but not empty. It carried that charged stillness old teachers leave behind, as if words once spoken there had imprinted themselves into the walls. She walked to the kitchen, tracing her fingers across the back of the wooden chair where Harold used to sit, and whispered, "You really did it, old man. You fixed everything." The kettle was still on the counter, and out of habit she filled it with water and turned it on, waiting for it to hiss the way he used to, calling it the most honest sound in the house. After the funeral, the town had changed toward her. The sideways glances in the market softened into nods. The pastor stopped by sometimes just to check in. Even the women from the church who once avoided her started including her in bake sales again. Redemption, she realized, wasn't something you announce, it's something that sneaks up behind you while you're too busy trying to be better. David had returned to his steady rhythm, work, church, raising Thomas, still checking on her every Sunday morning before service. They didn't speak about their marriage anymore. It belonged to another life. What bound them now was something cleaner, older, and somehow more honest. Shared responsibility, shared loss, shared promise. Thomas was 19 when he came home for the summer from college. He'd grown into his father's height and Harold's habit of listening more than speaking. One evening he found Melissa in the garden behind St. Paul's, kneeling beside the bench with the plaque. The maple's leaves shivered in the warm wind, and the light had that amber stillness that makes time hesitate. "I miss him too," he said, sitting down beside her. She smiled. "You sound like him when you say it like that." "I've been reading his journals," Thomas said. "He wrote every day, even when his hands got bad. He said words were the only thing that never betrayed him." He reached into his backpack and pulled out one of Harold's old notebooks. The leather cracked and faded. "There's something in here for you." She took it carefully, feeling the weight of it. The handwriting was shaky but still elegant. She opened to a page marked with a pressed lilac. The words were short. "Melissa, when you read this, I hope you finally know what peace feels like. The trick to forgiveness isn't letting go. It's holding on without hurting." She closed the book and held it against her chest. "He always knew how to make sense out of things," she whispered. "Yeah," Thomas said, smiling faintly. "And then he made you do the hard part." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the evening sounds of the town, the distant hum of traffic, a dog barking somewhere down the street, the slow toll of the church bell marking 6 o'clock. Melissa looked around the garden, at the small plaques gleaming in the low sun, at the benches filled with couples and children, at the space Harold had fought to protect. "I think I know what I need to do," she said. Over the next few months, Melissa started visiting the local library, the one renamed for Margaret Thompson. It had a small corner room filled with books about community history and a bulletin board where people pinned memories, letters, even photographs. She talked with the librarian about starting a writing program for seniors, a place where people could tell their own stories before time blurred them. "Call it the second voice, she suggested, because sometimes the story doesn't end when you think it does." The librarian smiled. "That's beautiful. You sound like Harold." The program began modestly. 5 older folks, 2 donated laptops, a pot of coffee that was never full enough, but it grew quickly. Every week, more people came to tell their stories. Widows writing about love that survived silence, veterans confessing to fears they'd never named, old friends reconciling through paragraphs. Melissa listened to them all, guiding their sentences with patience Harold would have admired. Each time she helped someone find the right word, she felt like she was repaying another small piece of her debt to him. One afternoon, as she packed up after class, a man lingered by the doorway. "You don't remember me," he said softly. His voice tugged at a far corner of her memory. "I used to work with David years ago. I heard about your husband, Harold, right? I came to the funeral." He looked down, shuffling his feet. "He was a good man. I was one of those people who used to talk behind your back." I wanted to say I was wrong. She studied him for a moment, then nodded. "You just said it," she replied. "That's more than most ever do." Later that night, she sat in her car outside Harold's house, now Thomas's home when he wasn't at school. She still had a key. The porch light was on, that same soft amber glow that had always made the place feel safe. She went inside quietly, leaving a small envelope on the table. Inside was the emerald ring she'd shown Harold that rainy night years ago, and a note that said, "For Thomas, when he's ready to build something new." She knew he'd understand. The years folded into each other again, smooth and relentless. Thomas graduated law school at 24, his hair just starting to curl the way David's once did. He asked Melissa to sit beside him on the stage instead of the empty seat they'd saved for Harold. During his speech, he said, "My grandfather taught me that justice is just the grown-up word for fairness, and fairness begins at home." When the applause faded, he looked down at her and mouthed, "Thank you." Melissa built her life around the library and the garden. She never remarried. Some people found that sad. She found it peaceful. She spent her mornings tending to the flowers Harold had planted, her afternoons helping strangers put their memories on paper, her evenings watching the sun set through the same porch window he'd loved so much. Sometimes she'd talk to him, not out loud, but in that quiet internal voice that belongs to the living who've made peace with ghosts. One spring, nearly 15 years after his death, she received a letter with no return address. The handwriting was unfamiliar but careful. Inside was a photograph of the garden bench, newly polished, the plaque shining bright. Someone had etched a new line beneath the old inscription. It read, "Because truth never really dies. It just waits for someone brave enough to tell it again." She smiled through tears, knowing it had to be Thomas. That evening, she sat at her kitchen table, the same one Harold had once leaned over, teaching her that redemption isn't a word, it's a decision repeated daily. She opened her laptop and started typing. The title came easily. "My father-in-law hid his pain so I could learn to heal." Her fingers hovered for a moment before she began, and when the words started to flow, they came like rain after a long drought. She wrote through the night, her story unfolding not as confession, but as tribute, to Harold, to David, to Margaret, to the quiet grace of second chances. When she finally finished, dawn was peeking through the blinds. She printed the last page and placed it beside Harold's photograph on the mantel. The photo showed him mid-laugh, eyes wrinkled, tie crooked, utterly human. "You win," she whispered, smiling. "You always do." Outside, the first birds were waking, and in the distance the bell at St. Paul's rang 6 times. The same hour it had the night she and Thomas sat by the bench years ago. The same hour Harold had always said was his favorite, because it belonged to no one yet. She stood there listening to it echo through the morning, feeling the strange weight of gratitude, heavy, beautiful, alive. And that was the true ending to everything that had begun with a hidden invitation. It wasn't vengeance that survived him, or guilt, or punishment. It was the steady rhythm of forgiveness turning itself into love, passed from one hand to another, like a letter finally delivered to the right address.